All right, welcome to another episode of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. It's been a long time since we've recorded one of these, Peter.
It has. It has.
I don't know, have you been really busy? Because I have been extremely busy.
I try to stay busy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when, things pop up, whether you want them to or not, as well as the things that you have planned. Has anything
Yeah.
happened since the last time that we recorded? I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say is there are two things that happened to precipitate us recording this. One is that we had a fan on one of the Wells groups that had kind of called us out because the question was in the Wells group, what kind of podcasts are there in the Wisconsin Senate to listen to? And thankfully, you and I both mentioned ours. Other people mentioned ours. And one of our fans said, I've been waiting for another Resisting the Dragon's Beast podcast and tagged us in it. And so thank you for that little push to get us moving. And then, yeah, there was something that happened Tuesday night with the presidential election. So what I thought we would talk about today is our reactions to it. Just a very open-ended question to begin with, Peter. What is your reaction to the election?
Um, I'm glad that we're done, generally speaking, done counting votes for the presidential election, and that the margin of victory for the winner seems to be enough that it's not going to come down to recounts, hanging chads, and Supreme Court cases.
Yeah.
And I guess that's my number one. And my number two is that I'm glad that at this point we haven't seen any, large amounts of groundswell of protesting, especially something that would turn violence. We call a violent protest a riot, and that we haven't seen that. I mean, I still hold out all sorts of hope because I have a very low view of the average person in a crowd thinking logically and clearly about what they should or should not do. But I'm still hopeful that that will not be the case going forward, that we can continue with politics as usual, whatever that means.
Yeah. And when I talked to Peter and I posted this on Facebook that we were going to finally be recording another podcast, I said this would either be a podcast of jubilation or one of lamentation. And I'm very excited that I feel it's a podcast of jubilation. Uh, and partly because you looked at, and I seen this meme going around, God has appointed a filthy minded, adulterous, wealthy man with evil in his heart to preside over a nation. And we thank God for him because that filthy minded, adulterous, wealthy man with evil in his heart that presided over a nation gave us a whole lot of Psalms in the Bible, and that man being King David. And I think that's a great way of looking at it because that's what people think of President Trump. But we should be thinking of that with all of us and all of our leaders, that none of us are worthy to be used by God to lead anything, to lead a church like us as pastors, to lead a family like you and I as fathers, uh, to lead a nation now like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. Uh, we think that God is going to use sinful people no matter who they are, what party they belong to.
Yeah, definitely. And that question was kind of floating around, and I think Matt Walsh had some commentary on it on like election day morning, if I remember correctly. That I'm not looking to invite Donald Trump to dinner at my house. If
Although
he,
it would be hilarious. He is an
no doubt,
entertainer. Yeah.
I bet, we could order in some McDonald's. Got the best McDonald's ever, and um, and I'm not looking him to head up an ethics commission or sit on our church council. I'm looking for somebody who would have the backbone and the courage to intimidate somebody else, because in worldwide politics, international politics, that was kind of one of the bigger questions for me. Was the question of who has more substance and just enough crazy to make the Chinese and the Russians blink.
Hmm.
And to me, Trump, I mean, you never know what he's going to say. for better or for worse. And he's got just enough crazy, or he knows how to work the deal, which was his book like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, The Art of the Deal. He knows just enough how to work that deal to keep the opposition unstable and give them a little bit of pause. And so I'm glad that at least he has the courage to do that. And also at least some of the wisdom to include some of the people that have already been named as being, future participants in his administration.
Yep. And we're going to talk about that. Uh, I did hear some of the detractors of President Trump before the election of saying, well, you wouldn't want this guy to babysit your kids. Well, no. I don't know about you, Peter, but I don't want any guy babysitting my kids.
We don't get babysitters. We parent our kids.
Yes. But if you did go out and you took your wife on a romantic date, you would get a babysitter. But
Yeah.
we're not going to have a guy. And like you said, you're going to have different qualifications for that teenager or that young lady, grandma that's going to be watching your kids than you are, someone that's going to be leading a nation. Though that's a false equivalency. One of the things I was thinking about with this is, our nation needs to repent. We have become a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. We are the nation of Israel in the Old Testament that has delved into paganism and pluralism of all these false gods and the evils that we commit with the murder of the unborn. We don't take care of the elderly and the poor, that uh, the way that we treat other people and so forth. That is, the nation of Israel. And look what God did to them. God destroyed Sodom. He destroyed Gomorrah. He took the nation of Israel away uh, totally, completely. He took the nation of Judah away for 70 years. God should very well do that to us. He can bring his judgment on us, and we should, as a nation, be calling and asking for repentance. But I also think that we need to be thanking God that I think with this administration coming in and the people we're going to be talking about that President Trump is talking about putting in place, that we can change our nation and turn it around and so forth. But we still need to be repenting because we still have those sins in our nation of the abortion and the sexual deviancy and so forth. And Lord willing, we will have the freedom as pastors and people to share this message of the gospel. That's what freedom allows us in our nation to do.
Yeah, and I mean, even back to kind of where we had begun, about King David or President Trump. I mean, well, David was a little shepherd boy when God chose him, and I think when we look at the candidates that we've got or that we had in the presidential election, just to pause for a second and say, was this the best that we could do? Out of the two options, I think that the option that we've got, President or soon to be President Trump again, is more friendly to the idea of personal liberty. But at the same time, maybe especially in this democratic republic that is our system, the people who run for office are those who know best how to pander and perhaps reflect where our culture is at today. And I guess that's the part that gives me just a little bit of pause, to say, I'm glad for the election. I'm glad for a peaceful election. But at the same time, if that is the litmus test of the best that our country has to offer, or at the very least, if that is the litmus test of what the values of our nation are, then we've got a lot of work to do, both patriotically and especially among the Christian church.
Yeah. I think if you look at the past, those national leaders we've had, uh, president, Congress, and so forth, we have moved further to the left. And even if we would have had Republicans in the White House instead of like Obama and so forth, we still would have been moving to the left. Now, they were not conservative. They were not conservative men or conservative women necessarily that were elected or appointed to be the vice president and so forth. We still would have been moving toward the left. So we need to understand that when we're talking about right and conservative, we're talking in political terms of what we're saying that what we believe as conservative Christians to apply God's principles here in our nation. And I've been having this discussion with people on Facebook lately, and I I really am loath to ever engage on Facebook. I don't usually make any comments, but I also understand that I'm not there to win an argument with someone. I'm trying to write in such a way for the other people who listen to you and I, Peter, and maybe because their pastors don't speak up and so forth. So I'm trying to be a voice for them as well when I write these things. And so what I always say is that we're trying to apply God's uh, scriptural principles of his right hand heavenly kingdom here in God's left hand kingdom. And that's politics. And we'll talk about that a little bit with, whether pastors should or should not be talking politics. But you kind of teased this before. Uh, we want to talk this episode kind of talking about some of the people that President Trump may be putting into his administration, what they can do. So, Elon Musk, what do you think about Elon Musk?
What do I think about Elon Musk? Overall, I think his reputation, when he first kind of came on the scene, maybe a decade ago, probably 15 years ago, and became popular, it kind of coincided with the release of the movie Iron Man, and people are like, "Oh, here's real life Iron Man. He's this multi-billion-dollar man who's going to take us to Mars, and we're all going to be driving electric vehicles around Mars." Elon Musk, he's not my favorite person, I don't
Okay.
think. I mean, you could say that about a lot of politicians. On the other hand, I do appreciate the fact that he is a businessman who understands business law and wants to do his best to streamline some things. And you can see that in, for instance, the rocket launch they had a couple weeks ago, where they did something after only maybe 15 years of work that NASA has not accomplished after 60 years, 70 years of investment of U.S. taxpayer dollars, where they launched a rocket and then they caught the rocket on the way back down. Something crazy like that. Apparently, it's a big deal. It's a gigantic rocket. And I appreciate his business acumen for being able to do that, and the fact that he is willing, or at least appears willing, to entertain discussions that are outside of our cultural norm, because that is the biggest thing, at least to me, that he appears to be in favor of an open conversation about things, and he brings some business acumen to pare things down, to make some cost savings, and he's already demonstrated the ability to run a business, to organize that business, and to run it efficiently enough so that in the private sector he has done something that a publicly funded government agency has not done in decades. And so in that regard, I'm glad to see that he's going to be on the list.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of the discussions I've had with people on social media is that we should be looking at all of our leaders and to see if they're Christian, so they have that Christian worldview, or at least if they're not Christian, if they have a moral compass, that natural knowledge of God that he has placed into the hearts of every person. And because if they have the wrong starting point, they're going to have the wrong conclusion. And so I don't know if, say, President Trump is a Christian or not. He's talking more Christian-like after the assassination attempt and so forth. Uh, Elon Musk, I don't think, is a Christian, and yet he definitely has a moral compass.
Mhm.
And you hear him talking about these things. You look at the history of how he kind of got involved in politics, that it started with buying Twitter. And the reason that he gave for buying Twitter is because of a joke. A joke that the Babylon Bee, a satire site, made about uh, someone called Rachel Levine, in the government, where Newsweek had said that this guy who dresses up as a woman uh, was the woman of the year. So the Babylon Bee named this person the man of the year, and because of that, Twitter back under Jack Dorsey then said that was hate speech and then banned the Babylon Bee. And the Babylon Bee could have said, all right, we're just going to take the loss on this one. It's just a joke. But they refused to back down. And because they backed down, uh, you know, they appealed to Elon Musk, who then ended up buying Twitter, naming it X, and then has given us free speech uh, in that social media platform, whereas you don't really have free speech on Google or YouTube, which is owned by Google, and Facebook and everything that's and Meta, which owns Facebook, Instagram, and so forth. And then when Musk went in to Twitter, and you kind of reference this too, he knows how to run a business. He cut 80% of the job force. And nothing was noticed by anybody as far as Twitter was concerned. It was able to continue on with 80% less workforce. And that's what I would encourage if he's involved in any kind of labor with our government to cut so much of what is bloated in our nation in the government and cut it down. And this is going to be a recurring theme in everything I'm going to talk about here is take it away from the government. Give it back to the private sector. Because what have you ever seen, except for the military, that the government does better than the private sector does?
And that's just a matter of funding. And I guess that's a good point. And then after the takeover or the purchase of Twitter, when we had the release of the Twitter files, where there was actual data about how Twitter had influenced their algorithm and what was presented to people and who was allowed to see your content, that was an important one. Because that's still one of the big questions that hasn't been properly addressed is to what degree do online sources where people get their news, to what degree do they have a responsibility to not hide your things? Where the Twitter policy before Elon Musk was, well, you have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And it's this silly argument that says you can say what you want, but we don't have to let anybody see it. Mm-hmm. And the whole intent, the idea of freedom of speech is that freedom of a dialogue. And I think I've touched on this before that a lot of these social media, like Meta and Twitter in particular, have tried to hide behind some of the benefits of being a telecommunications company, while also saying that they don't have to follow the freedom providing the services that the telecommunications companies provide, where your telephone company isn't allowed to cut your phone off because they don't like what you're saying. They are a service provider, and I think that's one of the things that Elon Musk kind of brings in that is really refreshing, to say something that maybe it ruffles a few feathers, but let's just say the emperor has no clothes and let's move on from that. Like call things what they are.
Yeah, and this is kind of a recurring theme on this podcast, and probably the next one too, is, should pastors be talking about things like this? Well, this one, I believe, yeah, absolutely, pastors should be talking about this because uh, when you're talking about limiting our reach on social media, shadow banning, a podcast and on like this or the YouTube video, when we try sharing it, Meta and Google can shadow ban it so it's not getting out there. But pastors can do this with their regular worship services that are online, with their sermons, their devotions, their books. If there's anything that they might might say or write that goes against any kind of community standards on social media, all of a sudden it's not being put out there. If there's an email that you send to your members and there's something that the company doesn't like, they can it's in the terms of agreement. They can say, I'm not going to send this out anymore. Yeah, they can definitely limit our reach of the gospel. And so this is why we as Christians should be very hyper focused on something like this, because it does, when Jesus commands us, go and get the gospel out to all nations. Social media is one of the main things that we can do in the 21st century to get the gospel out there. And when our reach is limited, we're not able to do what Jesus commands us to do.
And to think of that the freedom of religion in the First Amendment is one of the strongest freedoms that we have. And I'm reading this book right now. We're reading this book for book club. I'll have to go grab a copy of it in a minute. I think it's called Letters to Pastors by Matt Harrison. He's the president of the Missouri Synod. And it's basically a compilation of some of his writings and some of the columns that he has written in their church magazine, like their version of Forward in Christ. I think it's called Lutheran Witness. And paging through that, like so it's like all these short little articles, right? Every fourth or fifth article is talking about our rights and responsibilities as citizens, where he quotes James Madison, he quotes Monroe, he quotes John Adams, and he includes the text of something that he read at the U.S. House of Representatives, or maybe it was the U.S. Senate, talking about how the U.S. Senate and the laws of the land at the time in relation to homosexual marriage and homosexuality, the laws of the land had no problem protecting their freedom of speech and continually turned a blind eye to the freedom of religion. And he said, "Shame on you for not upholding the rights of your citizens when we have it right here in our Constitution, the First Amendment, that you will respect the freedom of religion, and you're not." And in that sense, it is a very refreshing read, because he comes at this with a pastoral understanding of law and gospel, as well as his understanding as a citizen. He doesn't say, well, not my circus, not my monkeys. I'm just here to make sure your soul gets to heaven. He says, you're a citizen of this nation, and they preserved for you this right to exercise your freedom. And like it or not, you're being put in a place where you are being compelled to compromise your religious convictions. And it'll be so easy to just roll over and say, well, maybe we'll get him next election, or, well, he's not commanding me to do something against what God says, and so I don't have to do anything. It's a refreshing read to see somebody like hold on to the Constitution and the rights that are there as firmly as we've got the pure word of God in Scripture.
Yeah. I think too often that we as Christians, we're going to apply Jesus' words of turn the other cheek and be as innocent as doves. That is absolutely true. We should be doing that. But then we forget the other side of, we're also called soldiers of the cross. Okay, there's military imagery there that we need to go forward and go against Christ's enemies, that we are also to be as shrewd as snakes. At the same time, we are innocent as doves. Only Jesus does it perfectly, obviously, but we go, as Lutherans, we often talk about being in the Lutheran middle road, but we're not. We often go all the way to one side and say,
It
well,
is so much easier because we're just
yeah,
lazy.
yes, that's really what it is. Exactly. Uh, let's talk about this, because I don't know if you're passionate about education or
I'm not
anything,
passionate
Pete.
about anything.
Yes, is I had
Education. Oh boy.
yeah, I had sent this to Peter several weeks ago when I saw that Trump was proposing a $10,000 tax credit for those per child for those who homeschooled. And what did do you remember what you wrote back to me?
Yeah, because it's in my heart and soul. I said, I don't want any government money. I
Yeah,
don't want to be on their radar at all. If they want, let's. Yeah, I don't want any government money. I don't want a tax cut. I don't want a tax benefit. I don't want you playing games with taxes. Let's just have like a national sales tax and call it good. I'm not an economist, but that's my opinion because that actually tracks according to expenditure. But that's just me. But I don't want any government money. I don't want to take it because there's always going to be strings attached. State of
yeah,
Ohio last year, they offered $250 per child if you're homeschooling. And we spent just yesterday, I spent $150 on our our oldest son, is using a Latin program. That's a hybrid. So you get the printout, you get the workbook, you also get this online app, and it's beautiful. It treats Latin like a language, not like a game. Picta dicta, if you want the reference there, Picta dicta, and it is fantastic. But it's $150. I don't want my neighbor paying for that because there's always going to be strings attached. As you can tell, I don't care about this at all.
Yeah, and we'll talk about taxes in a little bit, but with education, one of the things that President Trump had said he wanted to do was, cut the Department of Education. And there's all kinds of hand wringing about that, and yet that's because we forget. And the Department of Education was started in, do you know this, Peter?
No, I don't.
Okay. You just seem to know all this stuff. So 1979. It's not that old. It's not that long ago. And our children were educated just fine for decades and centuries without a centralized national federal Department of Education. And I would argue in the last several decades, since we've had a nationalized education system, have our children gotten smarter or not quite as smart? And so I think what President Trump is proposing, and I pray that he is able to do it, is get rid of that Department of Education. What you and I keep saying the whole podcast is, give it back to the people and let us educate our children in the best way possible. For you with homeschooling, and I love homeschooling. I think it's way better than even what we can do in our best Lutheran grade schools and high schools. We can't ever do as good as a parent can do in the home one-on-one with their kids. But give us, just allow us to educate our children the way we know how to do it. Don't tell us all the way from Washington, D.C. how to do it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that we care so much about these national elections. But by and large, and hopefully Trump is an anomaly and an exception to this, by and large, the further the government is from you, the less impact it has on your life. And if we just delete the whole Department of Education and USDA while we're at it, you got Joel Salatin coming in,
that was on my list. Yep.
Give that man a razor blade. He'll just start cutting.
So, yeah, we'll talk about him in a minute. Okay. So what else about the Department of Education?
And because even constitutionally, and this is in the citizenship test for becoming a U.S. citizen, that education belongs to the states. So if we actually believe that education belongs to the states, and that's what the Constitution says, and that's the way that we are set up, why do we need a federal government version of education? Guess what? We don't.
Right. And with that, as we're talking about cutting, is then cut funding to colleges and so forth, because that's why education is so expensive, is because you keep giving these colleges money. You give them $15,000 per kid. Well, what's going to do with that education? It's just going to go up $15,000. It's the same thing.
There's two things. There's two things. Number one, you allow the government to rewrite the contract, because when they wrote the student loan bill, they wrote it in such a way that even if you declare bankruptcy, you can't bankrupt your way out of student loans. You declare bankruptcy, all of your other debts are expunged, but student loans stick with you. It's guaranteed money. And if they write a law, which would have to be retroactively affect these other private contracts, but we did that with Obamacare, so I guess that's a cool thing that we do now. If they allow negotiation on that, then all of a sudden the citizen who has a loan is back in the driver's seat and has some leverage. And then secondly, not everybody has to go to college, because before student loans and federal funding came along, then colleges and college education was funded predominantly by the wealthy benefactors, the people who had gone to that school and the alumni. And then the Alumni Association would basically grant scholarships. There's a whole lot of option that doesn't involve going to a college or university of some sort. And to say, that everybody has to do that. Well, even getting your computer science degree from Berkeley with a 4.0 doesn't guarantee you a job in today's economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you're talking there, it reminded me of two other things that we can cut. Maybe President Trump should just call us up and
Yes, yes,
yeah,
I agree.
yeah, because I'll be all in on just cutting stuff. One is Obamacare, since you mentioned that. Get rid of it because what's happened to your insurance? It's gone through the roof because it's nationalized, because the government is overseeing it. Again, the theme today is just let government get out of us, a lot of our lives, and just let us live. So Obamacare. Another one would be the FACE Act. Just get rid of it. The FACE Act was written a while ago and was supposedly written so that you can't legally be in front of an abortion clinic and protest, and also in front of a church. But people aren't really protesting in front of churches, and if they do, they're nothing is done to them by the Department of Justice, the DOJ. Yet the DOJ goes after Christians who are standing and even praying in front of abortion clinics, and it is again something that is directly targeting Christians, and so that's why you have to get rid of it.
Yeah, and the FACE Act ostensibly to also protect places of worship, and protect people from intimidation, injuring, or interfering with somebody who is exercising their First Amendment right. In that sense, it's superfluous. But we would like to believe, we tell ourselves, and lawmakers tell us that if they pass a law, then that will fix this, that will protect this, that will make things better. Let's just like make fewer of them.
Yep. Exactly. Another one that we can defund immediately is Planned Parenthood. Why are we funding a private enterprise that murders the unborn? You know, cut all of those millions of dollars. And something for our listeners and viewers to watch is you might still be able to watch it free on X. I did it 2 weeks ago with my wife. Is a documentary called The 1916 Project. And so it's a play on the 1619 Project, which is written by the left on when our nation supposedly really started in 1619 when the first African American slaves came to our nation. And then the history is based on that. The 1916 Project is about Margaret Sanger and the beginning of Planned Parenthood. And then it ties in how Hitler and the Nazis used everything that they found in from Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood. It was named something different back then, and then brought it over to Nazi Germany. And then that's what instilled everything and getting rid of uh, the mentally handicapped, the Jews, the gypsies, and so forth. It all started with Margaret Sanger, and I encourage our listeners to watch the 1916 Project.
And the science of eugenics. And I guess
That's the
the
word.
big
Yep.
thing, the big thing here is that pastorally, I came up with the slogan. I haven't seen it disproven yet. It's not scripture, but it's been helpful. That nothing good happens when the one with the responsibility is let off the hook. And the government, federal government, wants to take all of the responsibility away from us. You just go through your day, you pay your taxes, you work your job. Don't worry, we'll educate your kids, we'll feed them breakfast, we'll feed them lunch, we'll take care of them, we'll give them after school care, we'll do all these things. But the bottom line is it's letting parents off the hook from taking responsibility for their own actions, for their own ethics and morality. And also it's letting parents off the hook of everyday things like raising your children, parenting your children, being involved with your children, and then using the force of government to say that that you as the private citizen, because we the government said your house is worth this much, now you need to pay us this much in taxes, and that I'm in favor of paying taxes because God says that we need to pay taxes to whom we owe taxes. I question the secular wisdom of taxing somebody on the unrealized value of property that they own and that they say is their property, but if they don't pay these taxes, then it's all of a sudden not their property. That sounds like a libertarian rant for another time and another day.
Well, no, let's go there. We're going to
Okay.
jump ahead to a libertarian, Ron Paul, uh, because I had read in my news source, which is not the Bee, which goes along with the Babylon Bee, that Elon Musk had reached out to Ron Paul on X to ask him if he would be in the Trump administration. And so some of the things that Ron Paul has proposed is, cutting the federal government. Uh, Trump talked about this, and Ron Paul has no national income tax. And again, that was passed in 1913. So our nation was doing fine before that too. You can figure out ways to raise money with other kinds of taxes. I know Trump has said tariffs, have the companies that and nations that want to send stuff into our nation, let them pay, fund the government. And then,
Because it's the understanding that we are the largest market, we are the largest consumer market in the world, and if you want to sell things here, then we'll make it easy for you, but stop charging tariffs on our side. There's tariffs
yep,
on the other side too.
yep. So this goes back to why Trump is a businessman. He understands this kind of stuff. And then to bring back, to help our American economy, to bring companies back to America. One of the things he did uh, in one of his rallies and speeches, probably about a month and a half, 2 months ago, was he called out John Deere, by name because they wanted to build a John Deere factory nearby in Mexico. And Trump said, if you do that and I'm elected, I'm going to put such high tariffs on you that you won't be able to afford selling those tractors here in the States. And what did John Deere do? They said, oh, we're not going to build that factory. We're going to stay here. And I've talked about this in Bible studies with my people too, of why it's so important to have uh, our own nation being able to build things. You go back to 2020 with COVID, we did not have the capability of even making masks. We didn't have the capability of making the plastic suits and so forth for the medical personnel or anyone. We had to get all of that stuff shipped from China, who they were not selling that stuff.
Mhm.
Okay, they wanted to make it just for themselves, and we don't even have the a way to do it. One of my favorite shirts, I'm not going to give the brand name, but it's made here in America. It's a plaid shirt like what I've got. I'm sure this is like a cheap Chinese or Taiwanese shirt. This one was made specifically here in America, but the company owner said that he had to develop everything from little on from his company or the other companies, just how to make a button, how to make a snap, how to sew certain things, where to find the cotton and so forth, because we had lost all of that over the last few decades.
And it would be interesting, I mean, to see how the tariffs all play out and if that actually gets passed and what other modifications to the tax law. If we get TurboTax and Intuit out of lobbying for tax law modifications,
Oh,
like they're the ones who supply the tax software that we all use, and they also lobby our congressmen to keep our tax code very complicated, unlike the rest of the world. But with the understanding that in this market economy system that we've got, that our country is trying to compete with countries like China that are able to use slave labor. And we said ethically, we don't want to do that. And so tariff is a way to make our product competitive with theirs, to say there's no tariff on things made here, and there is an actual cost being paid on the other side, because that person, that country, that company is utilizing labor that we don't want to use. But it puts that responsibility back on them to say that if you're somebody who is using and not treating your employees well, not treating your employees fairly, then you need to manage that for yourself.
yeah. Ron Paul has also said that he would cut at least $1 trillion out of our $15 trillion budget every year. Uh, the the legacy media where I heard this, they were saying all of this was a bad thing. Like they were saying, well, we're going to lose 440,000 jobs in the government because Ron Paul also wants to get rid of TSA. He wants to get rid of the IRS and but move all of that to the public sector. So yeah, you might be losing 440,000 jobs in the government, but if you think that you need something like someone to check over our safety in when we're flying and so forth, if you think we need someone to check over our taxes, let private companies do those things because, like you said, and I've said, that private sector that is closer to us is always going to be more efficient than something that is huge and monstrous. Uh, if nothing else, just getting rid of the TSA and IRS is a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean the IRS does also a lot of investigative work with larger things and a lot of organized crime and financial crimes like that, and I'm grateful for that. I know a couple of people who work in that sector of the IRS, but I would also say that in a lot of other countries, you can dial a phone number, put in your own personal identification number, and they'll tell you how much taxes you owe, and you're like, okay, I'm done. You don't have to sit down and collect receipts and sit down with the software that you paid for in order to just process your your tax return, and that's evident when the IRS comes back and says, "Oh, you're correct," or "You overestimated, underestimated, and here's what you actually owe." Like if you knew all along, why didn't you just tell me?
Yep. And you and I mentioned this all the time too with people when it comes to uh, like stewardship of gifts, and we talk about paying taxes. I always reference that you and I, Peter, we are, even though we're paid by the church and we work for the church, we're classified as, we're independent and so forth. And so we have to pay quarterly taxes. Uh, there was a time, the first few years of ministry, when I wasn't making a whole lot in the ministry. You and I still don't make a whole lot, but uh, where I would come home 4 times a year and I'd find my wife crying. And she'd be crying because we didn't have any money left in the bank. We'd be down to like 250 because we had to pay our quarterly taxes. And I always say if all of our citizens in America had to not have taxes taken out of their paycheck, but if they had to write a quarterly check, 4 times a year for a large sum of money and send it to the government, our taxes would be way lower when they all of a sudden uh, this huge chunk of their taxes, their bank account is gone, but we don't realize it because it's taken from us. Uh, Ron Paul talks about ending the capital gains tax, where we're actually being taxed on being successful.
Mhm.
The last thing I mentioned with this is, you know, not spending money on a war in Ukraine. That's I don't know where our listeners are on that, but the big thing is if you paid attention to what happened with the hurricane and the storms and the flooding that went into North Carolina and so forth, and then our government did not have the money to give to our own people as they were suffering, and that's because we were giving tens of millions of dollars over in Ukraine.
And we didn't have the electric transformers to replace the ones because we sent a bunch overseas. I mean, ethically and probably biblically, the responsibility of a government is to attend to their own people.
Mhm.
And should we do humanitarian things on the other side? Yes. Is that what we were doing in Ukraine? I'm not sure.
Right.
I think Dwight Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex is more true than we want to realize. And my personal opinion, I haven't read much about Ukraine in a long time, but it looks a lot like money laundering for Northrop Grumman and McDonnell Douglas and a lot of the people who manufacture the things that we are sending over there through our allies.
Right. And then, how about agriculture? Why were you so excited before when you mentioned who has been
Joel
appointed to?
Salatin?
Yeah.
Yeah, Joel Salatin, Polyface Farms, the guy who basically is the grandfather of modern rotational grazing and pastured chickens and chicken tractors, and the guy who after 25 years of running his farm in this way, instead of like a feedlot, but with beef that are raised on grass, which by the way, grass-fed beef has a much better, much more beneficial fat profile as opposed to beef that are just grown on the feedlot in Kansas. That's the size of a city. Anyway, Joel Salatin, after 25 years of doing this, had to replace his entire fence because he had generated almost 18 inches of topsoil from these cows just being cows. I think I think it goes to a number of things. Number one, our health. Number two, even the bureaucracy. When I've been to Washington, D.C. a couple of times, and we drove past the Department of Agriculture, and the tour guide always says there's more people working in this building than there are farmers in the United States.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about healthy foods, the idea that eating a healthier diet and making it more approachable in some way for the American people is going to hopefully lead to fewer complications and fewer disease ramifications further on down the line, as well as opening the door even on the discussion of climate, that the world around us is worried about climate change, and a lot of the answer seems to be let's trust in technology to fix this. When God's given us the perfect thing to turn grass into food, that you don't need to use the Impossible Burger from the store because you have a cow and it's delicious. And so I think he brings an entirely different perspective and he's a legend in the world of regenerative agriculture, and I think he would bring a whole lot more perspective to what agriculture could be, as well as the resilience and flexibility of a nation that needs to have a closer connection, I think, to where its food comes from. That it isn't just plastic and styrofoam at the store, but that this was an actual animal. And if we've got that level of resilience, then something like Hurricane Helene happens, or global warming, if that's what we're calling it, or whatever the next phase of our climate is, it doesn't matter. But it's that if somebody is closer to where their food comes from, it's going to be a healthier thing and a better thing for everybody. And I think that's the perspective that he could bring,
Yeah.
as well as
And
cutting the budget.
yes, and with that too, I grew up on a farm. It was a small one, but I know my dad and other farmers were paid then, and they are paid now to not farm. Okay. So that's and there's farmers that are paid not to, um, you know, to have their cows milk. Well, they have to milk their cows, but they're dumping the milk and so forth, all to inflate prices and so forth. I raise chickens. You know, I sell my eggs to members at church, and they will say, "Well, your eggs taste way better than the store-bought ones." The store-bought ones are all uh, there's a reason why all of their eggs are white. They're all bleached. You know, my eggs are all different colors. We were pretty excited. My four little hens now are full grown, and they finally started laying. They've just been lazy the last few months and not laying. But we got one the other day. It's a really tiny egg because they have to go row and finally get the big eggs, but it's an Easter egger. So it's a different color. If I wasn't colorblind, I'd tell you what color it was, but it was still cute. Uh, but you're not going to see those colored eggs in the store because they're all bleached. They don't last as long as the natural ones from our chickens and so forth. With
And that they're using like the white leghorns, which are like the king. You'll get almost 400 eggs, 350 eggs a year out of those chickens, and they lay white eggs, but they aren't very good foragers. They don't have the best temperament, and a chicken that is raised on grass and is able to find its own bugs and root around, you're going to have a much better fat profile. I guess
yeah,
this isn't a chicken podcast, but it could
well,
be.
but we're talking about eating healthy and so forth, and I forget which country it was, if it was Sweden or the Netherlands, but several years ago, they gave the government gave each family that wanted them three chickens.
Denmark.
It was Denmark, okay. I knew it was one of those. But gave each of their families three chickens, and then they could build their coop and all that stuff. And you know what happened to their waste products? It went way down. There is nothing in my house, and then even in our early childhood campus, anything that's left over is put in an ice cream bucket, and I take home and I feed to the chickens. And what Denmark realizes, yeah, their garbage dump went way down. Their people were healthier because now they're eating the eggs and so forth. My wife Shelley and I we've canned a lot of food in the last 3 years, and it's our own food or food that was given to us and so forth. There's still a lot of sugar in it, but that's it. There's no
Mhm.
other preservatives like you're going to have in everything else. And that gets to the last one I wanted to talk about was RFK Jr.
Well, I got one more
Oh,
thing
yeah.
on the food front. There's a saying, I
Yeah,
forget
you're going to talk about
who to
quail, aren't you?
attribute it to, that if you want to know anything about quail, shoot me an email,
Yes.
pastorhagen@icloud.com, because I don't have 3 hours on a podcast today. Um, anyway, I forget who to attribute it to, but the notion or the quotation that every problem in the world can be solved in a garden. And I mean, biblically, it fits too, because the problem of the Garden of Eden is solved in the problem in the solution of Gethsemane and the solution of Joseph of Arimathea's garden tomb. But aside from that, the idea that a closer connection to your food means that you are more secure, that you can take responsibility for your own responsibilities, that you maybe interact with your neighbor. Your neighbor works shift work, but and they can't take care of the chickens or whatever the case may be. So maybe all of a sudden you've got a little bit of commerce there, and you've got the exchange of money, or maybe they let you dig a little bit of land in their backyard, and then you've got kale growing there. But that idea that
Why kale?
kale,
What?
because it is nutrient
Oh,
dense, and you'll be chewing it for like the next 3 weeks.
that's stuff to feed the chickens, anyhow.
Yeah, they love it. They love it. But also that idea that this was recognized back in the 90s with the book Bowling Alone, that as a culture, we don't really have a town square anymore, and we don't need to interact anymore. And this podcast began by talking about both sides, talking past each other, and the division that we have, even over politics. And what that takes isn't just voting our guy into office or our gal, but it also takes interacting with our neighbor, which is where it ought to be. And then all of a sudden, that sort of interaction where the neighbors, you talk about chickens or kale or whatever, then you have a more resilient community. And you've got the perfect setting to actually say, I care about you. Here's some eggs. I care about you. Here's my Jesus. Here's my church. It just goes hand in hand with who we ought to be. And this division of people into segmented bubbles and containers is not the way that we're designed to be. It's anti-human. It's Gnostic.
Yeah.
Come around to that
And
again.
and again, why would pastors talk about this stuff? Why would we care about this? Because this is about health. Health is important to us. We are tasked already in the book of Genesis that we are to
Work it
control
and take
and
care of it.
yeah, we're supposed to take care of, sustain our land. And so, something you were saying there at the end reminded me of this is my daughter Miriam went to school for an agricultural engineering degree. And she is very big on these different ways of farming that are very different than the way we do it in our nation, like no-till. You know, not turning over the ground with a huge plow and then disking it up and then planting. That's the way I grew up. That's the only way I know how. And yet I was sitting at lunch the other day, and uh, one of our members was telling me about her son who has his drone license. And so he's got a big drone, 4 big blades, and he goes over the field with, I think this was like winter wheat or something. And then just before the corn was going to be harvested, that he dropped the oats in there, and then instead of it going and being planted in there and dug down, that naturally the rain falls, and then that's going to drive the oats in there, so that when the corn is harvested, you still have the stalks there, and then that's the shade for the oats and so forth. And but that's using something that is very unique and timely with a drone and dropping the seeds over and go back up and down. And then so no till, so you're not losing all of those nutrients as they are baked out or blown out. They're still in the ground, so you don't need the fertilizer, and then you don't have that being unhealthy and so forth. And then with the veggies and so forth, uh, my theory is, there's like a dozen vegetables that I like, and anything else, then I
Potatoes
feed
don't count.
I throw that to the chickens, and then that's how I get my vegetables when I eat the chickens and I eat the eggs.
Excellent.
Yeah. Uh, but then with one more thing with being healthy with RFK Jr., uh, you know, I'm just looking to see what he's going to do with the CDC, the FDA, and so forth. Again, he's all about health. What are we putting into our bodies as far as vaccines and so forth? What are we putting into our bodies with all of these different things? Just look at any label on anything that you buy from the store, and there's all kinds of things that you can't read, that you can't pronounce. Why? Why are we putting those things that we don't know what they are into our bodies? That cannot be healthy.
Hmm. And I guess coming at it from a different direction also, that the FDA, at least from my semi-informed perception, is that the FDA, kind of sets the rules for what is or is not allowed. Where there are actual known carcinogens that are banned in other countries that are commonplace in American food, but also the concept that a free market like drug system where companies develop their drugs and then they own the patent to it and then they can sell that drug for a period of time to make a profit off the thing that they produced. Within that system, there is an incentive to keep somebody using that drug. And so perhaps there is a tendency for these companies to develop things that treat symptoms rather than pursuing something that will get to a root cause. I don't know the extent of that. I'm not a scientist, whatever. You all know that. But that question that in a free market economy should have a few governmental curbs and guidelines and limits so that the free market economy works for the benefit of the people. And that is not where we're at. That my perception is that it works for the benefit of the individual stockholder at the detriment of the people. Do you want something that will treat your heartburn, or do you want something that will help to heal your liver?
Yep.
Those are two different things. Or maybe just the simple answer of don't eat so much and don't eat the junk food because it's going to give you inflammation. There's a myriad of responses to that, and it seems that the FDA has been allowing and encouraging only one particular response, which is you can profit off of this ability to treat a symptom.
Yeah. Just recently, my wife uh, had to go to the doctor, get a checkup because several months ago her eye exploded. She had a detached retina, and so her eye just was filled up with blood. And so she had to have surgery for that. When that was fixed, then she was getting excited to be able to get new glasses, and then the doctor said, "Well, now you have a cataract in that eye because you were messing around with it." So she had one cataract done. I had two cataracts done this year. We're old people officially, and uh, but because she went to the doctor, they said, "Well, you have high blood pressure." Well, and they wanted to give her these pills, and she took them until she had the surgery, and then she stopped because she doesn't believe she really has high blood pressure, and she doesn't want to continue with those kind of things of just always masking the issue, as opposed to if there is an issue, we're going to be looking for different kinds of doctors that have natural medicines and so forth. Uh,
Mhm.
so the theme that we're talking about today is why I'm excited about this election is, Lord willing, even though Republicans, as long as I've been alive and paid attention, they've always talked about a smaller government and then they never go through. I'm hoping, I'm praying that this is a mandate when you see that President Trump has won the not only the electoral college, but he won the popular vote, which no Republican has done in the last 20 years. So he's done that. So it's a mandate. And there's a mandate that the Republicans also have the Congress, both the House and the Senate, even though there's a slim margin in one, and the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of good there, but that means you can't squander it. You have to do things, and I'm hoping that they do the things that we're talking about. If they're not going to do them, then they should call us up again, and we'll get in there, because this again is very biblical, I think, because when we have such a big government, what has it done? The government takes, they're the ones that are taking care of the homeless, the needy, the hungry.
Lets us
Scripture,
off the hook.
exactly. Scripture does not say that the government should be doing that. Jesus says very clearly in Matthew 25 and elsewhere, that's our job. Jesus doesn't have the people on the right who are in the government taking care of the poor, the widows, the homeless, those that are in the jail and so forth, and feeding them. He's saying that to Christians. That is our job. But like you said, we're taken off the hook because the government does it, not doing it as well as we could in the public sector. And going to the whole taxes, we don't have the ability to do it because we can barely afford groceries and gas and so forth. So if government is less, and then that lowers our taxes, now we have the money to do that because we're not working so many hours. We're not working two jobs and working overtime. So we have the time, the energy, and the income to do what God has called us to do as Christians.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, at least for my part, wrapping it up a little bit here, I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier that that to a degree, the candidates for the chief executive office are a reflection of where we're at culturally. And Trump is an anomaly. We'll talk about that next time about how he's a populist who has never served in the government before being president. But the thing that really struck me about this whole thing, this whole election, especially the last week leading up to the election, was the number of Christians who like on social media or whatever would post about, you know what, I don't care about the election because no matter who wins, Jesus is still king. So I'm not going to worry about the election because Jesus is still in charge, because Jesus is still king. You know, trust not in men, in mortal men who cannot save. That, you know, that sort of a thing. And it just struck me the wrong way, as a bunch of schoolyard whining, as though we're bullies. Like, nah, 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 nah. You know what? I don't even care who wins this election because my guy wasn't even on the ballot and he's a king. He doesn't get voted in. This schoolyard whine that wants to use Jesus as a cultural club against my neighbor disgusts me.
Yeah.
That's the biggest reflection out of all this. You know, don't trust in doctors because they're mortal, but yeah, don't trust in men because they're only mortal. But if you're sick, only a fool would go to a doctor that he knows is a sham and doesn't do the job well. Like, you want to find a good physician. And similarly, you want to have a good person, or a person at least whose policies won't work against the American Constitution. You want that person in the chief executive seat. But and in that sense, you know, the candidates were a reflection of us. But seeing the reflection of how many people who were like, all of a sudden they don't know how it's going to go, and everybody's like, it's a coin flip, who's going to win this election, and they're like, well, Jesus is still king, I'm not going to worry about it. Well, first of all, that's foolish, because it separates, it's a Gnostic separation of the body that is yours. You live in a place, and you are under a government. And secondly, it doesn't present Jesus in any sort of a gospel light, doesn't talk about the gospel aspect of it, and instead uses my Christianity as a club against my fellow citizen. Like, oh, what? So what? You win, I lost, but my guy wasn't on the ballot. And that part really grates me, because that isn't the setting. Jesus isn't here to be a political pawn. Even if you're like, well, he's still the king, even if my candidate won, or even if my candidate didn't win. And I think that one we need to pursue a little bit more, a little bit of soul searching on that, because if Jesus were really king in a person's heart, would we have gotten this worked up about an election?
Mhm. Uh, well, thank you. It makes me think about my closing, but I'm still going to use my closing
You're welcome.
in a few minutes. I want to encourage all of our listeners, to go to Resisting the Dragon's Beast on Facebook, and then, read some of the things that are posted there. Something I posted just the other day was by my daughter Belle, who's a freshman at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee. Very proud of what she had written in that. The title of her paper is Why Christians Should Be Involved in Politics. And my associate said, wow, you just threw her to the wolves by posting it all over on social media. Uh, but, you know, I'm very confident in what she wrote. And most of what the responses to it have been very positive. But, uh, I'll be honest that I did help her with the wording and so forth because I'm a writer, but every one of the thoughts was hers, her original thoughts, and which is fantastic. So I encourage you to read it and share it. Uh, and then this is from my one of my other daughters. She had texted, "Thank you for not being silent and standing up for what you believe in and telling the members to vote based on their beliefs." That makes me really proud too, that I raised daughters, and then the men in their lives, they work really hard to get out to vote. It's not easy for college students to do it when they're away from home or in the military and so forth. Uh, they were very active in their faith, and we'll talk about that next time. So, Peter, you want to tell everyone what we're going to talk about next time?
Next time, I've got a top 10 list, and I don't have it all organized. It might be a 10 plus 1 list of things to consider as we, especially moving from one administration back to the now second Trump administration, as well as Christians who are in this country and considering their status both under God and under the government.
Okay.
So a top 10 plus 1.
Very good. And then I'll wrap it up here that one of the things I did on Wednesday is I had seen an article on Not the Bee of uh, people who their party did not win the national election, and their TikTok videos and so forth, they're crying and so forth because they lost. I don't know. I'm I'm hoping that those are not Christians that feel that way. Uh, if they voted that way, their conscience, and that's fine. But they shouldn't be so upset. If our of the people or the party that I voted for, if they would have lost, and the Christians that voted for uh, Trump and Vance, I don't know if we would have cried like that. At least I hope not. And why? Well, this gets to what you were saying before is we have to have the confidence that no matter who's making the rules, we have Jesus Christ. He's made the rules. That no matter who we have that is in the court, like the Supreme Court, we have God who is sitting as the ultimate judge. And no matter who is elected, either from one party or another, as president, Jesus Christ is king. And that is our confidence no matter what. It's not a time to gloat. It's not a time to be sorry. It is a time to trust in Jesus Christ and then to put his words into action in everything we do. And that's politics. And those are things that you and I are going to be talking about too, of why, like Bella says, why Christians should be involved in politics, why pastors like you and I and others should be talking about these things. So
I
that's
like that
for
she included the quote about Hulu and Hot Pockets on resisting the dragon's beast.
Yeah, she did. That's one of my favorite quotes of myself in the book of Hulu and Hot Pockets. And I did say that one of the things that I liked about sharing that paper is because she quoted me twice in the end of the paper. All
As
right,
well.
well, Lord willing, we'll make this more regular and Lord's blessings on your week.